What happens when a single piece of jewelry can destroy the carefully constructed lies that built an empire? For Rebecca Stone, a 28-year-old bartender drowning in her brother's rehabilitation costs, that piece was a vintage ruby brooch she'd inherited from her aunt. For Harrison Vale, the oil tycoon whose refineries dominated the Gulf Coast, it was a relic from his past that threatened to expose the blood money his dynasty was built upon. She was just trying to survive another crushing shift. He was just another powerful man seeking privacy for his business dinner. But when her brooch caught on his jacket during service, tearing loose to reveal an identical crest engraved on his cufflinks, both their worlds would shatter like glass. This isn't a story about fate. This is about how a moment of recognition can ignite a fire that burns down generations of carefully constructed deception, and how sometimes the dead refuse to stay buried. The amber glow of Ashford's private club cast long shadows across the mahogany bar, where crystal decanters caught the light like trapped stars. At 10:15 on a Wednesday night, the club hummed with the low conversations of politicians and power brokers, their voices mixing with the soft jazz drifting from the piano in the corner lounge. Rebecca Stone polished wine glasses with mechanical precision, her burgundy vest and crisp white shirt the uniform of invisible service. Every bone in her body ached from pulling double shifts, but her brother's latest stint in rehab wasn't going to pay for itself. The private facility was their last hope, and her tips from serving the city's elite were all that kept him from the revolving door of state programs. The antique ruby brooch on her collar had belonged to her great-aunt Margaret, a woman who'd raised Rebecca after her parents died in a car accident. It was an ornate Victorian piece, a golden eagle with spread wings, its eyes two perfect rubies, clutching a shield bearing an intricate family crest. Despite its obvious value and her desperate financial situation, Rebecca had never been able to bring herself to sell it. Aunt Margaret had made her promise to keep it safe, claiming it held the key to their family's true history. At the corner table, a man sat reviewing contracts by lamplight, his presence commanding the room without effort. Harrison Vale was approaching 70, with iron-grey hair and eyes like winter storms. His navy suit was hand-tailored, and the platinum cufflinks at his wrists probably cost more than Rebecca earned in 6 months. He owned the largest oil refinery network on the Gulf Coast, and his word could make or break entire communities. As Rebecca approached with the aged whiskey he'd ordered, her exhaustion finally betrayed her. The thick Persian rug caught her heel, sending her stumbling forward. She managed to save the glass, but her brooch snagged on the fine wool of his jacket, the old clasp finally giving way under the strain. The brooch tumbled onto the polished table with a soft, metallic ring. Harrison Vale froze mid-sentence in his phone conversation, his steel-grey eyes locking onto the fallen jewelry. The color drained from his weathered face, as if he'd seen a ghost rise from the grave. "I'll have to call you back," he said into the phone, never taking his eyes off the brooch. "I'm so terribly sorry, sir," Rebecca stammered, reaching for the piece. "Please let me just— don't touch it." His voice was sharp as a blade, stopping her hand inches from the brooch. He leaned forward, studying the golden eagle with an intensity that made Rebecca's skin crawl. The brooch gleamed under the lamplight, its ruby eyes seeming to stare back at him with accusation. The family crest on the shield was clearly visible, an intricate design featuring a lighthouse, crossed anchors, and a banner with Latin text. "Where did you get this?" Harrison's voice was barely controlled, each word precise and deadly. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. "It was my great-aunt's, Margaret Stone. She left it to me when she passed." Harrison's hand moved to his cufflinks, platinum pieces that bore the exact same crest as her brooch. His fingers trembled as he touched them, comparing the designs with growing horror. "Margaret Stone," he repeated, the name falling from his lips like a curse. "That name. It can't be. You knew her?" Rebecca whispered, suddenly aware that every person in the club seemed to be watching their exchange. Harrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Margaret Whitmore died in 1953. She was 23 years old. She worked for my father, and she was killed in an explosion at our Galveston refinery. The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. That's impossible. Aunt Margaret lived until 2015. She raised me. She told me stories about her youth, about working for a powerful family before something terrible happened that forced her to disappear. Disappear? Harrison's voice cracked with something between rage and desperate hope. What did she tell you about that? Rebecca glanced around the club, aware that their conversation had drawn curious stares from other patrons. She said she witnessed something she shouldn't have. That a man died because of corporate greed and cover-ups. She had to change her name and run, or they would have killed her too. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Harrison stared at the brooch, then at Rebecca's face, seeing something there that made his breath catch. "The explosion," he whispered. "She saw what really happened that night." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather wallet from which he produced a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Refinery, Explosion Kills 12. Whitmore Heiress Among the Dead." Below the headline was a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She bore a striking resemblance to Rebecca, particularly around the eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. "Margaret Whitmore," Harrison said, his voice hollow. "Daughter of Admiral Thomas Whitmore, one of the wealthiest shipping magnates in Texas. She was supposed to marry me, but she started asking questions about safety protocols at the refineries. Questions that threatened to expose my father's cost-cutting measures." Rebecca studied the photograph, her mind reeling. The woman in the picture could have been her twin, separated by 70 years. "If Margaret Whitmore is my great-aunt," Rebecca said slowly, "then what does that make us?" Harrison looked at her with eyes that seemed to see her for the first time, not as a servant, but as something far more dangerous and precious. "If Margaret survived and became Margaret Stone," he said, his voice breaking, "if she raised your family and gave you that brooch, then you're not just some bartender who stumbled into my life. You're the great niece of the woman whose death haunted me for 70 years. You're the living proof that my family's greatest crime wasn't buried as completely as we thought." The brooch lay between them on the mahogany table, its ruby eyes glinting like drops of blood. It was more than just jewelry. It was evidence, a witness to secrets that powerful men had killed to protect. But Margaret Whitmore hadn't died in that explosion. She had escaped, hidden, built a new life under a new name. And now her great niece sat in the heart of enemy territory, wearing the very proof that could bring down the empire built on her family's grave. The following morning, Rebecca found herself in the passenger seat of Harrison's armored sedan as they drove through the gates of the Vale estate. The mansion before them was a testament to oil money, a sprawling antebellum palace surrounded by manicured gardens and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. "I never brought anyone here," Harrison said quietly as they pulled up the circular drive. "This house holds too many ghosts." Inside, the mansion was a monument to Southern aristocracy. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. Harrison led her to his private office, a room paneled in rich walnut that smelled of leather and old secrets. "I need to show you something," he said, moving to a floor safe concealed behind a painting of an oil derrick. "Something I've kept locked away for 7 decades. He withdrew a metal strongbox and placed it on his desk. Inside were documents, photographs, and personal effects that made Rebecca's blood run cold. There were letters in a feminine hand, love notes signed "Your Devoted Margaret," and newspaper clippings about the Galveston explosion that told a very different story than the official version. "The truth about that night," Harrison began, his voice heavy with decades of guilt, "is that Margaret discovered my father, Cornelius Vale, had been cutting safety corners at the refinery. Outdated equipment, insufficient fire suppression, minimal worker protections, all to maximize profits." Rebecca picked up one of the newspaper clippings, studying the grainy photographs of the destroyed refinery. "But the investigation found it was an accident, Because my father owned the investigators, Harrison said bitterly. Margaret tried to warn the workers, tried to get them to strike for better safety measures. She was going to expose everything, even if it meant destroying our engagement. He pulled out a telegram, dated 2 days before the explosion. Must speak with you immediately. Have proof of father's negligence. Cannot marry into family built on workers' blood. She never got the chance to deliver her evidence, Harrison continued. The explosion happened first. 12 men died, including the union organizer she was supposed to meet. The official story was equipment failure, but he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But your father caused it, Rebecca said, the horrible truth crystallizing in her mind. He murdered 12 people to silence one woman. I thought she died with them. I spent 70 years believing the woman I loved was killed because of my family's greed. I never married, never had children. I became exactly the kind of ruthless businessman my father wanted me to be, because I thought there was nothing left worth protecting. Rebecca thought of her great-aunt's stories, the sadness that sometimes clouded her eyes when she spoke of her past. Margaret had never mentioned Harrison by name, only referring to the young man with kind eyes who was trapped in his father's shadow. She never stopped loving you, Rebecca said softly. She used to tell me about a man who wrote her poetry and dreamed of using his family's wealth to help people instead of exploiting them. She said he had the potential to be great if he could just find the courage to break free from his father's influence. Harrison closed his eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. She waited for me to become the man she believed I could be. Maybe it's not too late, Rebecca suggested. Maybe that's why the brooch brought us together, to finish what she started. Before Harrison could respond, the office door burst open without warning. A man in his 40s strode in, his expensive suit unable to disguise the calculating coldness in his eyes. Behind him came a woman of similar age, her designer clothes and perfect makeup creating an armor of respectability. "Uncle Harrison," the man said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Mrs. Chen from the club called. She said you had some kind of episode last night. Brought home a guest." "James," Harrison said, his tone immediately guarded. "This is Rebecca Stone. Rebecca, my nephew James Vale, and his sister Patricia Vale Morrison." Patricia's gaze swept over Rebecca's modest clothing with barely concealed disdain. "How quaint! And what brings Miss Stone to our family home?" The possessive way she said "our family" made Rebecca's skin crawl. She could see the immediate calculation in both siblings' eyes, the assessment of potential threats to their inheritance. "Rebecca is Margaret Whitmore's great-niece," Harrison said simply. The effect was instantaneous. James went rigid, and Patricia actually stepped backward. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. "That's impossible," Patricia breathed. "Margaret Whitmore died in the refinery explosion. It was 70 years ago." "Apparently not," Harrison replied, his voice carrying a warning edge. "She escaped, changed her identity, and built a new life. Rebecca is living proof that our family's greatest shame wasn't buried as completely as grandfather thought." James found his voice first, his tone sharp with panic. "This is ridiculous. Some random bartender shows up with a convenient story and an old piece of jewelry, and you're ready to overturn decades of family history. She's obviously running an extortion scheme." "The brooch is authentic," Harrison said coldly. "It matches my cufflinks exactly. They were part of a set commissioned for the Whitmore Vale engagement that never happened. And her story explains things that have never made sense about that night." Patricia moved closer to the desk, studying the documents with the intensity of a predator eyeing prey. "Even if this fantastical tale were true," she said slowly, "it changes nothing legally. Margaret Whitmore has no claim to anything. She was never officially part of this family. But her descendant might," Harrison said quietly. The words detonated like a bomb in the quiet office. Patricia's composed mask cracked, revealing the naked greed underneath. "What exactly are you suggesting, Uncle?" James demanded, his voice rising. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time this family faced the truth about how our wealth was built. Maybe it's time we made amends for grandfather's crimes. Crimes? Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. You can't seriously be considering legitimizing the claims of some opportunistic stranger based on 70-year-old gossip. I'm considering acknowledging that Margaret Whitmore deserved justice, and that her family deserves the recognition that was stolen from them, Harrison shot back. The tension in the room was suffocating. Rebecca could see the wheels turning in James and Patricia's minds, calculating how this revelation threatened not just their inheritance, but their entire social standing. "I think," Patricia said with dangerous calm, "that we need to be very careful about accepting unsubstantiated claims from outsiders. The Vale family reputation is built on generations of integrity. It would be tragic if it were damaged by someone with questionable motives." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized the same ruthless calculation that had destroyed her great-aunt's life all those years ago. "Are you threatening her?" Harrison asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm protecting this family," Patricia replied smoothly, "as someone should have done 70 years ago." Rebecca realized with growing horror that history was repeating itself. She hadn't just stumbled into a family reunion, she had walked into the same trap that had nearly killed her great-aunt. The war for the Vale legacy had begun. Over the following weeks, the attacks were swift and merciless. Rebecca's shifts at Ashford's were mysteriously eliminated due to budget constraints. Her brother's rehabilitation center suddenly required additional insurance verification that tied up his treatment in red tape. Her landlord received an anonymous complaint about suspicious activities in her apartment, triggering an investigation that threatened her lease. When Rebecca's car broke down and the mechanic informed her that someone had sugar in her gas tank, she knew the gloves had come off completely. Harrison, meanwhile, had become obsessed with uncovering the full truth about the Galveston explosion. He hired forensic accountants to review the original insurance claims and brought in structural engineers to analyze the official accident reports. "The more we dig, the worse it gets," he told Rebecca during one of their secret meetings in a downtown cafe. The equipment that supposedly failed had been inspected just days before the explosion and was in perfect working order. But someone had tampered with the safety systems. "Sabotage," Rebecca said, the word tasting bitter. "Calculated murder," Harrison corrected grimly. "My father didn't just allow that explosion to happen, he orchestrated it. Margaret wasn't supposed to be there that night, but she'd gone to the refinery to collect evidence. The explosion was meant to kill the union organizer and destroy any documentation of the safety violations." "But she survived," Rebecca said, thinking of her great-aunt's stories about hiding in the wreckage, waiting for rescue that never came because everyone assumed she was dead. She was found by a fisherman 2 days later, half dead from smoke inhalation and burns, but alive. He helped her get to a hospital in another county, where she was treated under a false name. The picture that emerged was even more heartbreaking than Rebecca had imagined. Margaret had spent months recovering from her injuries, too afraid to return home or contact anyone from her old life. She'd eventually made her way to Oklahoma, where she'd found work as a seamstress and slowly built a new identity as Margaret Stone. The breaking point came when Rebecca arrived at her brother's rehabilitation facility to find him being discharged against medical advice. The head administrator explained apologetically that there had been irregularities in his admission paperwork that required immediate review. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. His treatment was approved. The insurance was, "There have been questions raised about the accuracy of the initial assessment," the administrator said uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, Miss Stone. Our hands are tied." Rebecca knew with absolute certainty who was behind this. She also knew that her brother wouldn't survive being thrown back onto the streets with his addiction untreated. That evening, she called Harrison from a payphone outside the facility. "They're going to destroy him," she said without preamble, "just like they tried to destroy Margaret." "Who? What happened?" She told him about the discharge, the insurance problems, the systematic dismantling of her brother's treatment. As she spoke, she could hear Harrison's breathing grow harsh with fury. 70 years, he said finally. 70 years and they're still using the same tactics. Still destroying innocent lives to protect their secrets. What am I supposed to do? I can't fight them. I don't have the resources. Yes, you do, Harrison interrupted. Or rather, you will. I've been working on something, but I need you to be strong enough to see it through. Are you prepared to finish what Margaret started? Rebecca thought of her great-aunt's final words. The truth has a way of surfacing, honey. Sometimes it just takes the right person to dig it up. Yes, she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Tell me what you need me to do. The annual Vale Foundation charity auction was held in the ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. It was the social event of the season, where oil money masqueraded as philanthropy and powerful families maintained their carefully crafted public images. Rebecca had never imagined she would attend such a gathering. The ballroom sparkled with crystal and gold, and the guests wore clothing that cost more than most people earned in a year. She felt like an intruder in the elegant evening gown Harrison had insisted on providing, but he'd been adamant that she needed to be there. This is where it ends, he'd said during their final planning session. In front of everyone who matters, James and Patricia worked the room with practiced ease, their smiles never faltering even as they kept careful watch on their uncle. They'd grown increasingly concerned about his erratic behavior in recent weeks. His obsession with family history, and most disturbing of all, his growing alliance with the bartender who claimed to be related to a dead woman. The evening's program proceeded normally through the cocktail hour and dinner. Wealthy patrons bid on artwork and vacation packages while congratulating themselves on their charitable generosity. But when Harrison took the stage for his traditional closing remarks, something was different in his demeanor, a tension that suggested the evening was far from over. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system, "tonight I want to talk to you about the true cost of our prosperity." A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the expected speech about community giving and corporate responsibility. 70 years ago, Harrison continued, my father Cornelius Vale made a decision that has haunted our family ever since. To protect his profits and silence a whistleblower, he orchestrated the deaths of 12 innocent men at our Galveston refinery. The murmur grew to shocked gasps. Patricia was pushing through the crowd toward the stage, her face pale with panic. The woman who tried to expose his crimes was named Margaret Whitmore. She was my fiancée, and I was told she died in the explosion along with the workers she was trying to save. A spotlight found Rebecca in the crowd. She lifted her chin, meeting Harrison's gaze across the ballroom with steady determination. But Margaret Whitmore didn't die that night. She survived, changed her identity, and spent the rest of her life in hiding. Too afraid to come forward with the truth, Patricia reached the side of the stage and was frantically gesturing to the event coordinator, trying to get him to cut the microphone. But like everyone else in the room, the coordinator was transfixed by the unfolding revelation. "Tonight," Harrison said, his voice growing stronger, "I'm proud to introduce Margaret Whitmore's great-niece, Rebecca Stone, who has helped me uncover the full scope of my family's crimes." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Some guests were applauding, others were talking loudly among themselves, and several were heading for the exits. But Harrison wasn't finished. "I'm also announcing that I've discovered evidence of recent criminal activity within my own family. Attempts to intimidate and financially coerce Miss Stone into abandoning her investigation." He looked directly at James and Patricia, who had both gone white as sheets. "These attempts have been fully documented and will be turned over to federal prosecutors. Anyone involved in this conspiracy to silence Margaret Whitmore's family will be held accountable to the full extent of the law." Patricia's composure finally shattered completely. "You delusional old fool!" she shrieked, her voice carrying even without amplification. She's nothing but a con artist. A gold-digging bartender who what, Patricia? Harrison's voice cut through her hysteria. Who refused to be bought off? Who chose justice over money? He gestured to Rebecca, who was walking toward the stage with her head held high, despite the hundreds of eyes upon her. Margaret Whitmore was 23 when she discovered that the man she loved came from a family built on blood money, Harrison continued as Rebecca joined him on the platform. She chose conscience over comfort, truth over security. She gave up everything, her name, her fortune, her future, to protect the workers my father was determined to exploit. His voice broke with 7 decades of suppressed emotion. I can't give Margaret back the life she lost. I can't undo 70 years of hiding and fear. But I can make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. He turned to Rebecca, taking her hands in his. I can't replace your great-aunt, and I can't erase the struggles your family has faced because of mine. But I can promise you this. The Vale family fortune will never again be used to silence the truth or harm innocent people. He faced the stunned crowd once more. Effective immediately. I'm dissolving the current family trust and establishing a new foundation dedicated to worker safety, environmental protection, and supporting the families of those killed or injured in industrial accidents. The ballroom had fallen into stunned silence. Even Patricia stood frozen, realizing that her uncle's public confession had destroyed any chance of containing the scandal or maintaining their social standing. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd of oil executives and society matrons. These were the people who had always existed in a different world from hers, untouchable in their wealth and privilege. But tonight, for the first time in her life, she felt their equal. My great-aunt Margaret used to tell me that the dead don't rest easy when their deaths serve injustice, she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. She said that someday someone would have the courage to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. She looked at James and Patricia, who stood amid the wreckage of their carefully protected legacy. Today is that someday. The aftermath of the charity auction sent shockwaves through the Texas oil industry. James and Patricia were arrested within days on charges ranging from extortion to conspiracy to obstruct justice. The evidence Harrison had quietly gathered, with Rebecca's help and that of federal investigators, painted a damning picture of their systematic campaign to silence her. The revelation about the Galveston explosion triggered a federal investigation that uncovered decades of safety violations, cover-ups, and corporate intimidation tactics. The Vale oil empire, built on the foundation of Cornelius Vale's ruthless ambition, faced billions in fines and legal settlements. But from the ashes of the old regime, something meaningful began to emerge. 6 months after the auction, Rebecca stood in the gleaming lobby of the Margaret Whitmore Center for Industrial Safety, watching as construction crews put the finishing touches on the facility's dedication wall. Her brother, his addiction finally under control, thanks to the treatment Harrison's new foundation had funded, worked beside her as the center's first community outreach coordinator. She would have been proud, he said, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. Aunt Margaret always said that every person who dies for someone else's profit should be remembered. The center would provide safety training, legal advocacy, and support services for industrial workers and their families. It was the first of many projects funded by the restructured Vale Foundation, now run by a board that included labor representatives, environmental advocates, and Rebecca as its executive director. Harrison approached from across the lobby, moving with the careful steps of a man who had carried guilt for 7 decades, but was finally learning to transform it into purpose. The dedication ceremony is about to begin, he said, offering Rebecca his arm. Ready to honor Margaret's memory properly? Rebecca smiled, touching the ruby brooch at her throat, the same piece that had started this extraordinary journey. She'd had it restored, and now wore it not as a hidden relic, but as a symbol of truth finally brought to light. I think she's been waiting for this day for 70 years, Rebecca said, as they walked toward the auditorium where hundreds of workers and their families waited. Not wealthy donors this time, but the people whose lives would be protected by Margaret's legacy. Harrison squeezed her arm gently. She raised a family that finished what she started. As Rebecca stepped up to address the crowd, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought her here. From a struggling bartender to the heir of a legacy built on her great-aunt's sacrifice. And finally, to someone who could transform that legacy into something Margaret would have been proud of. The truth had indeed surfaced, just as her great-aunt had always believed it would. And in its wake had come not just justice, but the rarest gift of all, the chance to turn a story of tragedy into a testament to courage. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected the struggles of working people everywhere, Rebecca began her speech with the words Margaret had whispered to her so many years ago. The dead don't rest easy when their deaths serve injustice. Today, we're not just opening a safety center. We're proving that no amount of money or power can silence the truth forever. In the audience, she could see Harrison wiping away tears, and she knew that somewhere Margaret Whitmore was finally at peace. Her love story hadn't ended in tragedy after all. It had just taken 70 years to find its way to justice. The story of Rebecca Stone and Harrison Vale reminds us that the courage to speak truth to power can echo across generations. Sometimes it takes a stranger with nothing to lose to show us that our greatest strength isn't wealth or influence, but the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us everything. Margaret Whitmore never got to see the empire that was built on her silence transformed into a force for protection and justice. But through her great niece, her unwavering commitment to truth became the foundation of a new kind of legacy, one that proved the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to let it remain hidden. What would you have done in Rebecca's place? Would you have had the courage to challenge a powerful family, even knowing it could cost you everything you held dear? If this story moved you, please share it with someone who believes in the power of ordinary people to change the world. Don't forget to follow our channel for more stories that celebrate the triumph of justice over greed and truth over power. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with money or influence, but with the simple refusal to let injustice have the last word. Thank you for listening to this tale of courage, sacrifice, and the incredible power of one person's determination to honor the dead by protecting the living.